We are born into a theater, and before we even learn to speak, the mask is gently placed upon us. It begins as protection, a way to be accepted, to be loved, to survive in a world that demands performance. The mask learns quickly how to smile when it wants to cry, how to obey when it longs to rebel, how to appear confident while trembling inside. It imitates what others reward. It absorbs the voices of parents, teachers, society, until one day, the echo becomes so loud that it drowns out your own. The tragedy is not that the mask exists. It is that you begin to believe it is you. You identify with the persona, the roles, the image reflected back by others. You polish the surface, fearing that if it ever cracks, no one will stay. But deep within, there is a quiet ache, a feeling that something essential has been forgotten. That ache is the whisper of your soul, calling you home. The mask is clever. It tells you that without it, you will be nothing. It warns you that authenticity is dangerous, that vulnerability will destroy you. But the truth is the opposite. Every moment you pretend to be what you are not, your spirit dims. Every time you silence your truth to keep peace, you lose a piece of yourself. The mask may protect you from rejection, but it also isolates you from life itself. To remove the mask is not to destroy it. It is to see it clearly for what it is, a tool, not a prison. It was never meant to define you, only to help you navigate the world. The moment you stop clinging to it, you discover that beneath the surface lies something real, raw, and radiant. The one who observes the mask, the awareness that has always watched, even in silence, that is you. And when you live from that awareness, the mask can still serve its purpose, but it no longer rules you. You speak not to impress, but to express. You act not to fit in, but to be true. The world may not understand, but your soul will finally breathe. For the first time, you will feel what it means to exist without pretending. To be seen, not as a role, but as a presence. And that is where true freedom begins. From the very moment we enter this world, we are bathed in invisible forces that shape the way we think, feel, and see ourselves. Before we can even form our own thoughts, the collective begins its quiet instruction. It teaches us what is good and bad, what is worthy and shameful, what is possible, and what is forbidden. It tells us how to behave, how to dream, even how to love. Every story, every rule, every expectation we absorb from family, school, and culture becomes a thread in the fabric of the false mind. We are not born into freedom, we are born into conditioning. And yet, this conditioning is so subtle that we rarely notice it. It does not command us directly, it whispers. It says, be like them. Do not stand out. Stay safe inside the pattern. It rewards obedience and punishes authenticity. It tells the child who sees the world differently that their vision is wrong. It tells the sensitive heart that its depth is weakness. It tells the dreamer to wake up and be practical. And over time, we learn to betray ourselves in exchange for belonging. The collective is not evil, it is unconscious. It fears what it does not understand. It builds systems and identities to maintain order, even if that order suffocates the soul. Jung understood that the great task of life is not to adapt perfectly to this collective pattern, but to individuate, to awaken from it. Individuation is the sacred rebellion of the soul, the act of remembering that you were never meant to be a copy of the collective mind, but a living expression of your own. As long as you live according to borrowed values, you will remain restless. Something within you will keep asking, whose life am I living? That inner unease is not failure, it is the self trying to awaken you. The false mind will tell you that breaking away means isolation, but the opposite is true. Only when you free yourself from collective conditioning do you truly connect with others. Not as masks meeting masks, but as souls meeting souls. To unlearn what the world has taught you is not an act of defiance, it is an act of remembrance. You are not here to continue the unconscious patterns of the past. You are here to bring awareness into them. When you see the collective clearly, without anger or judgment, you step outside its hypnosis. You begin to live from a deeper intelligence, one that does not seek approval, because it knows its own truth. And when that awakening happens, you no longer move with the crowd's rhythm. You move with the rhythm of your being. The collective may call you strange, rebellious, or even lost, but you will smile, for you will finally know, The only thing truly lost was your false identity. The moment you remember who you are beyond conditioning, the world itself begins to change in your presence. There is a wound inside you that is quieter than any scream and more persistent than any pain, the split between who you show to the world and who you are when all masks fall away. It is a fracture that begins in childhood, a subtle bifurcation where parts of you learn to perform and other parts learn to hide. One half learns the language of safety, compliments, smiles, compliance, while the other half learns the language of truth, longing, contradiction, hunger. Over time these halves drift apart until they speak almost different languages. You do not so much live as you negotiate between them. This split breeds a strange fatigue. You wake each day with an itinerary of roles and expectations that must be fulfilled, and by evening you wonder why your chest is empty. The mind keeps score of appearances, the heart keeps inventory of absence. In public you respond with polished phrases, in private you nurse an ache of unspoken names and unlived possibilities. The tragedy is not simply that the parts are separate, but that you learn to prefer the safety of the performed part. The mask becomes comfortable. The hidden part becomes suspect. You begin to distrust your instincts because they do not fit the accepted script. When the inner division is large, life becomes a series of dissonant decisions. You choose what looks admirable and suppress what feels true. Relationships become bargaining tables where pieces of your soul are traded for approval. Creativity is muffled by practicality. Joy is rationed because it seems irresponsible. The split steals your integrity by convincing you that adaptation is the only pathway to survival. And yet, beneath this theft lies an invitation, the uneasy sensation, the restless dream, the recurrent sadness that will not be anesthetized. These are the self knocking. Meeting this split requires a different kind of courage than any outward rebellion. It asks for a slow, relentless honesty, not violence against the persona. There is no need to tear it down in fury, but an unflinching willingness to witness it. You must become the observer who notices when you perform versus when you speak from the center. Name the small betrayals, the compromise made to avoid a quarrel, the story you tell to seem acceptable, the desire you silence because it embarrasses the image. In naming, the split loses some of its automatic power. Awareness stitches a seam where denial once reigned. There are practical corridors through this inner house of mirrors. Pay attention to recurring dreams and images. They are the language of the parts that do not speak in daylight. Practice solitude not as isolation, but as an apprenticeship in listening. Keep a journal that answers not only what happened, but what wanted to happen. Invite the body into the conversation. Feelings often lodge there before thought can find them. And when you find a difficult truth, anger, envy, longing, tend to it with curiosity rather than judgment. Each fragment you welcome returns you a little more of yourself. Integration is not a clean, linear process, it is messy and patient. You will discover that reclaiming a hidden part often requires mourning what the mask once gave you. Protection, connection, approval. That mourning is real and necessary. Loss precedes rebirth. But as you mourn with presence, new capacities emerge. Authentic warmth replaces polished charm, meaningful boundaries replace people-pleasing, creative impulse replaces dutiful imitation. The inner conflict does not vanish overnight, but it is transformed into a dynamic tension that propels you toward wholeness rather than tearing you apart. Above all, remember this: the split has a function. It once kept you whole in an environment that required adaptation. It served when you needed it most. Now its usefulness has passed. Your task is not to condemn what protected you but to free what it kept hidden. When you do, the parts no longer fight for survival, they collaborate. The voice of the mask can still speak when needed, but it no longer pretends to be the whole of you. In that collaboration, life regains its coherence, and you step forward carrying the full measure of your living. The road back to yourself asks for persistent tenderness. Be patient with the parts that were taught to fear change. Invite them with gentle insistence, and keep returning to the small, honest acts of presence. Each time you choose a truth over a performance, you narrow the distance between your faces. Each time you allow a hidden desire to be heard, you reclaim a piece of destiny. The split, once exposed to light, loses its dominion, and in that light, you remember how to breathe as one being again. Most people live as prisoners without realizing the walls that confine them are made not of stone but of thought. The mind creates its own cell, a structure of words, beliefs, judgments, and fears, and then mistakes that structure for reality. We inherit ideas about who we are and what life is supposed to be, and without questioning them, we begin to live inside those invisible boundaries. We call them truth, but they are only narratives, temporary arrangements of symbols pretending to be eternal. Thought is a remarkable servant but a cruel master. It was meant to help us navigate the world, yet somewhere along the way, we began to worship it. We take its commentary as absolute, its worries as warnings, its opinions as identity. The false mind is addicted to this noise. It fills every silence with words, every space with interpretation. It cannot simply experience. It must label, compare, measure, and judge. When you start believing everything the mind says, you lose contact with what is. You live not in the world, but in a simulation of it, constructed from second-hand meaning. The prison of thought is self-sustaining. Each belief reinforces another. I am not enough, says one wall. I must prove myself, says another. If they approve, I will be free, whispers the gatekeeper. But the gatekeeper never opens the gate, because thought cannot think its way to freedom. The problem is not what you think, it's that you believe you are the thinker. You confuse the content of consciousness with consciousness itself. The prisoner and the warden are one and the same. Jung understood that the psyche is vast, multidimensional, yet the thinking mind insists on reducing it to a small, controllable narrative. It fears the unknown, and so it builds theories, identities, and dogmas to protect itself from mystery. But mystery is the language of the self. When we over-identify with thought, we exile intuition, imagination, and soul. The rational mind becomes an overbearing king who silences his poets, prophets, and dreamers. To escape this prison is not to destroy thought, but to see through it. The moment you become aware of a thought as merely a thought, it loses its grip. You begin to observe without being possessed. In that awareness, a new dimension opens, a silent, luminous presence that watches the stream of ideas pass by. This witness is not bound by them. It is the real you, the consciousness before the commentary. Meditation, contemplation, even deep creative absorption, these are not escapes from the mind but doorways beyond its limits. When you enter stillness, you realize that the mind is not the source of life, it is a reflection of it. Thoughts arise and dissolve like clouds against a vast sky that remains untouched. In that realization, fear begins to fade. You understand that you are not your doubts, not your failures, not even your dreams. You are the space in which they appear. The false mind resists this discovery. It will do anything to keep you thinking, to keep you spinning stories about the past and future, to distract you from the present, which it cannot control. But the present is where truth lives. When you rest there even briefly, you taste a freedom that no idea can describe. You begin to see that thought is not reality. It is only a reflection dancing on the surface of it. As you learn to inhabit this awareness, thought regains its proper place. It becomes an instrument rather than an identity. You can use it to build, create, communicate, but you no longer mistake it for who you are. You no longer chase approval or run from fear inside the maze of concepts. The walls begin to dissolve, and you step into the living moment. Raw, unfiltered, radiant. This is the beginning of true intelligence, when the thinker bows before the awareness that observes it. Then the mind, once your master, becomes your ally. You move through the world not as a prisoner of thought, but as a conscious being who can think, imagine, and create without being bound by any of it. That is the liberation Jung hinted at, the freedom not from life, but from the false mind that could never truly live. The shadow does not shout. It whispers. It speaks from the corners of your being, from the places you have learned not to look. It hides beneath your virtues, behind your politeness, under your achievements. It waits patiently, carrying everything you were told was unacceptable: your anger, envy, pride, fear, lust, your hunger for power, your longing to be seen. All the parts of you the world rejected, the shadow has adopted. It is your unwanted twin, your buried truth. The false mind fears the shadow because it threatens the image it has built. The mind wants to appear pure, controlled, and good. The shadow reminds it that it is also wild, unpredictable, and complex. So you exile what feels dangerous. You convince yourself that you are kind when you are also capable of cruelty, that you are humble when secretly craving recognition, that you are rational while your instincts burn beneath the surface. The false mind wants light without darkness, but life itself refuses to be divided so neatly. Every attempt to suppress the shadow only deepens its power. The shadow is not evil, it is unlived life. What you repress does not disappear, it retreats into the unconscious, gathering strength, shaping your choices from behind the curtain. It appears in projection, in the people you dislike, in the emotions you cannot explain, in the dreams that disturb you. You may say, "I hate arrogance," not realizing that it is your own repressed confidence asking to be seen. You may call others controlling because you have denied your own will. The world becomes a mirror where the shadow writes its message in reverse. To face the shadow is an act of sacred courage. It requires that you abandon the illusion of moral perfection and meet yourself with radical honesty. You must sit in the presence of your contradictions without rushing to fix them. You must allow the rage, the jealousy, the craving to surface, not to indulge them, but to understand their purpose. Beneath every so-called negative impulse lies a distorted expression of energy that seeks wholeness. Anger might conceal the longing for justice. Envy might reveal the desire for growth. Lust might point to a hunger for creative connection. When you listen without judgment, the shadow transforms from monster to messenger. The process is not gentle. The false mind will resist, it will rationalize, deny, project, and distract. It will say, "This darkness isn't me." But the moment you stop defending yourself against yourself, the walls begin to crumble. The shadow, once feared, becomes a teacher. It shows you where your strength has been imprisoned, where your creativity has been silenced, where your authenticity has been fragmented by fear. Each time you integrate a piece of the shadow, you reclaim a piece of your power. Jung said, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." Light is born from the union of opposites, not from the denial of one. The shadow's whisper is not a threat, it is an invitation to maturity, to integration, to depth. To listen to it is to take responsibility for the totality of your being. Only then can you stop living as a fragment and begin to live as a whole. When you embrace your shadow, compassion grows. You see that the same darkness that lives in you lives in everyone. Judgment softens into understanding. Empathy replaces superiority. You stop chasing purity and begin embodying truth. The false mind loses its rigidity because it no longer needs to defend an image. You move through the world not as a saint pretending to be good, but as a human being who has made peace with their own complexity. And then the whisper of the shadow changes. It no longer calls from the dark, it sings through you. Its energy becomes creativity, depth, and vitality. What once terrified you becomes the source of your authenticity. The light you share with the world no longer blinds, it illuminates. For true light is not the absence of darkness. It is the embrace of it. Beneath the noise of the mind, beneath the chorus of borrowed voices and conditioned fears, there exists a deeper current, a still luminous presence that has never been touched by confusion or chaos. This is the voice of the self. It does not shout. It hums like the pulse of existence itself. It is the silent awareness that has witnessed every thought, every joy, every wound you've ever carried. It was there before the mask, before the name, before the world taught you who you were supposed to be. The false mind lives in noise. It must, for it survives through comparison, judgment, and endless commentary. It analyzes, explains, argues, and doubts. It fills every empty space with chatter because silence exposes its illusion. The self, however, has no need to speak to prove its existence. It is. Its wisdom does not arrive through argument or logic, but through knowing, an inner certainty that transcends explanation. You recognize it not by sound, but by stillness, not by words, but by resonance. When you begin to sense this voice, it feels both familiar and foreign, like remembering a song you once loved but haven't heard in years. It speaks in symbols, in intuition, in moments of sudden clarity that have no rational source. It visits through dreams, through synchronicities, through the body's subtle responses when something is true. The self is not limited by time or identity, it speaks from the eternal center of your being. Every time you have felt guided without knowing how, every time you've sensed meaning shimmering beneath the surface of events, it was the self whispering through the veil. The false mind will try to imitate this voice. It will dress its opinions as intuition, its fears as wisdom, but the true voice of the self carries a distinct quality: peace without reason, conviction without aggression, love without condition. It never persuades or demands, it invites. Its guidance does not flatter the ego, but calls you to your highest truth, often leading you into discomfort for the sake of transformation. The self does not promise safety, it promises wholeness. To hear it clearly, you must become still enough to listen beyond thought. This is why solitude and silence are not luxuries, they are necessities for the awakening soul. In the beginning, the silence may feel unbearable, because all the suppressed noise of the false mind rises to the surface. You meet your anxiety, your restlessness, your unfinished stories. But if you endure, if you breathe through the chaos without running back to distraction, something miraculous begins to happen. The storm exhausts itself, and beneath it, a clarity emerges. That clarity is not something you create, it's something you remember. You realize that the self has been guiding you all along, through pain, through failure, through every detour you once cursed. Every experience, even the dark ones, was the self orchestrating your return to authenticity. The ego seeks control, but the self seeks alignment. Where the ego says, "This should not be happening," the self whispers, "This too belongs." Listening to the self does not mean withdrawing from the world, it means engaging with it from a deeper center. Decisions made from the false mind are reactive, they come from fear, pride, or desire. Decisions made from the self are creative, they arise from integrity and trust. When you align with this voice, you stop chasing validation and begin to act from inner necessity. You no longer move to impress, you move to express the essence that is uniquely yours. The self will sometimes dismantle what the false mind built. It will lead you to release relationships, careers, or beliefs that once defined your identity. This can feel like destruction, but in truth it is purification. The self removes what is false to make space for what is real. Every ending it orchestrates is an initiation into greater authenticity. To follow this voice requires faith, not in an external deity, but in the deeper intelligence of your own being. As you live from this awareness, something extraordinary happens. Life begins to mirror your inner state. The external world no longer dictates your worth, it becomes a reflection of your inner wholeness. Challenges turn into opportunities for integration. Silence becomes a friend. You realize that guidance is not something you seek, it is something you are. The more you listen, the louder it becomes. Not in sound, but in presence. You begin to feel it in every decision, every breath, every encounter. You realize that you were never separate from it, only distracted. And one day, perhaps without noticing, the boundary between you and the self dissolves completely. There is no longer a seeker and a guide, only consciousness, living itself through you. And in that moment, you understand the deepest truth. The voice of the self was never trying to change you. It was trying to reveal you. To awaken is to disobey, not out of rebellion for its own sake, but because truth demands it. Every soul that has ever touched its own light has, at some point, faced the terrifying necessity of saying no, to conformity, to fear, to the inherited rules of a world that prefers sleep to consciousness. The courage to disobey is not the loud defiance of the arrogant, it is the quiet, unshakable strength of one who chooses authenticity over acceptance. It is the moment you stop betraying yourself to remain loved by others. From birth, obedience is woven into our survival. We are rewarded for pleasing, for fitting neatly into the patterns laid before us. We are told that safety lies in agreement, that to belong we must bend. So we learn to shrink our truth to fit the expectations of the collective. We smile when we want to scream. We comply when something inside us begs to break free. Slowly, obedience becomes habit, then identity. We forget that following every external voice means abandoning the inner one that leads us toward our real destiny. Jung understood this imprisonment well. He knew that individuation, the realization of one's true self, cannot happen without conflict with the collective. The false mind thrives on obedience, because obedience protects the illusion of harmony. But there is no real harmony without truth. To obey the false mind is to remain in psychological childhood, where authority replaces awareness and rules replace wisdom. The courage to disobey is, in essence, the birth of inner adulthood. Disobedience does not always appear as revolution. Sometimes it is silent and invisible: the choice to think for yourself, to feel what you truly feel, to stop pretending. It can be the decision to walk away from a path that everyone calls secure, the refusal to stay silent in the face of injustice, or the bravery to live according to values that the world finds inconvenient. Every act of authentic defiance, however small, chips away at the tyranny of conditioning. But this courage comes with a cost. The world rarely applauds those who refuse its illusions. When you disobey the false mind, you may lose comfort, approval, even relationships. You may be misunderstood, judged, or ridiculed. Yet these losses are sacred. They mark the death of dependence and the birth of integrity. The false mind seeks validation, the true self seeks alignment. Each no you speak to falseness is simultaneously a yes to the soul. Disobedience is not chaos, it is order born from within. When you refuse to follow blindly, you become guided by something deeper than opinion or habit, your own inner compass. That compass will not always point to what is easy or popular. It points toward wholeness. It leads you through shadow, through uncertainty, through the dark nights of the soul where faith in yourself is tested. But only through such nights can your light mature from borrowed to self-generated. The courage to disobey is not only personal, it is archetypal. Every mythic hero faces the moment of departure, the crossing of the threshold where obedience must die so individuality can live. Prometheus defied the gods to bring fire to humankind. Buddha left his palace to seek truth beyond comfort. Christ overturned the tables of the temple. Each story carries the same message, that consciousness demands separation before it can return transformed. To follow your soul, you must first step away from the crowd. And yet, true disobedience is rooted in love, not resentment. You do not reject the world because you hate it. You step beyond its illusions because you wish to serve it more truthfully. When you follow the self, your defiance becomes creative. You no longer destroy for the sake of destruction, you dismantle falsehood so that something genuine may rise in its place. You become a living example of freedom, showing others that it is possible to live without pretending. As you walk this path, fear will whisper, "What if you are wrong? What if you end up alone?" But the deeper voice within will answer, "You may lose the world's approval, but you will gain your own soul." And that is the exchange every awakened being must eventually make. One day, you will look back and realize that every act of disobedience was an act of love, the love of truth, the love of wholeness, the love of the divine spark within you that refused to be silenced. The courage to disobey is the beginning of all genuine transformation. It is the point where imitation ends and creation begins, where the borrowed life fades and your true destiny ignites. For the soul cannot evolve while kneeling before the idols of fear. It must stand, even trembling, in its own light. And in that standing, in that sacred refusal, you are no longer merely surviving in the world. You are participating in its awakening. Transformation is never gentle. It is not the soft drift of petals opening under sunlight. It is the fire that burns the petals to ash so that new life can take root. Every real awakening begins in discomfort, in chaos, in the unraveling of what you once thought was certain. The false mind clings to what it knows. It seeks continuity, familiarity, control. But the self seeks truth, and truth requires change. The fire of transformation is that sacred force which strips away illusion, burns through the layers of conditioning, and reveals the essence that cannot be destroyed. You cannot awaken without first being undone. The process feels cruel because it demands the surrender of everything that is not authentic. Your masks, your attachments, your self-image, your borrowed beliefs. The false mind calls this suffering, but the soul calls it purification. The fire does not come to punish you, it comes to free you. It consumes the illusions that suffocate your spirit, exposing the raw, luminous core of your being. There comes a moment in every life when the old self begins to crumble. You feel it as disorientation, as if the ground beneath you has disappeared. The stories you lived by lose their meaning, the relationships that once defined you dissolve, and your ambitions suddenly feel hollow. The ego interprets this as failure or loss. But something deeper knows that what is ending is no longer aligned with truth. The fire arrives precisely when the soul is ready to grow beyond its current form. It is both destruction and creation, a sacred alchemy that transforms suffering into wisdom. In alchemical symbolism, the fire is the stage of calcinatio, the burning away of impurities so that the gold of consciousness can emerge. Jung understood this as a psychological process, the confrontation with shadow, the death of the persona, the breakdown of false certainty. Every time life burns away an illusion, a deeper truth takes its place. The more fiercely you resist the fire, the more painful the process becomes. But when you yield, when you stop fighting and allow yourself to be changed, something miraculous happens. Pain turns into power, fear turns into faith, and endings become beginnings. Transformation is not a single event but a series of deaths and rebirths. Each time you face a painful truth and choose awareness over denial, the fire refines you. Each time you let go of what no longer serves you, the flame brightens. Slowly your inner landscape changes. You begin to live not from reaction, but from authenticity. The false mind, once loud and demanding, starts to fade into the background, replaced by a quiet strength that comes from alignment with the self. The fire asks one thing of you: surrender, not passive resignation, but the active willingness to let go of control. Surrender means trusting that even as everything falls apart, something within you remains untouched. That something is your essence, the indestructible awareness that observes all change without being consumed by it. The fire cannot harm what is real, it can only burn away what is false. To live through transformation is to stand naked before existence. You lose your certainty, your defenses, your borrowed identities, and discover the vastness of your own spirit. This nakedness feels terrifying at first. There is no structure to hide behind, no external validation to cling to. Yet it is precisely in this vulnerability that true power is born. The phoenix rises not because it avoids the flames, but because it allows itself to be consumed by them. The false mind seeks comfort, the self seeks wholeness. Comfort preserves the old, wholeness demands the new. Transformation, then, is the divine tension between these two forces, the death of illusion and the birth of authenticity. Every trial, every heartbreak, every collapse you endure is not the universe punishing you, it is the universe sculpting you into a clearer vessel of truth. And when you finally emerge from the fire, you will not be who you were before. Your voice will carry depth instead of noise, your eyes will see meaning where others see chaos, and your heart will no longer fear endings. You will understand that everything you lost was never truly yours. It was only what you needed to shed to remember who you are. To walk through the fire of transformation is the highest form of faith, faith in life, faith in meaning, faith in the indestructibility of the self. For on the other side of that fire waits freedom, not the fragile freedom of circumstance, but the unshakable freedom of being, the kind of freedom that no loss can diminish, no failure can touch, and no death can destroy. Rebirth begins not in the outer world, but in the way you see it. When the false mind collapses, perception itself undergoes a sacred transformation. What once appeared as chaos begins to reveal hidden order. What once seemed meaningless now glows with quiet intelligence. It is as if the veil that covered reality dissolves, and for the first time, you are not looking at life through your thoughts. You are seeing directly. The false mind is a filter. It does not observe, it interprets. It labels, categorizes, compares and judges everything it encounters. It tells you what is good and bad, safe and unsafe, worthy and unworthy. Through this distorted lens, you don't experience life as it is. You experience only your conditioned version of it. You see what your mind allows you to see, not what actually is. And so, perception becomes imprisonment. But when the false mind begins to fall away, through suffering, reflection, or sudden insight, something extraordinary happens. The walls of interpretation weaken. The endless commentary fades. You begin to experience reality without the noise of thought. A leaf moving in the wind is no longer just leaf. It becomes alive, sacred, radiant with being. You see depth where you once saw surface. You feel the invisible pulse that unites all things. This shift is not merely psychological, it is spiritual. You realize that perception was never passive, it was a creative act. The world you saw was a projection of your inner state. When your mind was clouded with fear, you found danger everywhere. When your mind was filled with judgment, you saw flaws in all things. But as your consciousness clears, your perception becomes an extension of love. The outer world rearranges itself to mirror your inner clarity. In Jungian terms, this is the stage of integration, when the conscious and the unconscious begin to communicate. The opposites within you no longer compete for control, they collaborate. The inner split dissolves, and perception becomes wholeness. You start to perceive not from the persona or the ego, but from the self, the vast intelligence that transcends duality. You see that light and shadow are not enemies, but two aspects of the same divine movement. Rebirth of perception is not about gaining new beliefs, it is about losing the old ones. It is the unlearning of all the false meanings imposed upon life. The mind that constantly asks, "What does this mean?" falls silent. Meaning reveals itself wordlessly. You no longer need to control reality through definitions, you trust it. You see that every event, every emotion, every encounter carries a message for your evolution. The world becomes a mirror of the soul, and every reflection invites you deeper into awareness. As perception transforms, so does your relationship with time. The past loses its grip, and the future ceases to torment you. The eternal present opens, vast, still, and alive. You no longer chase fulfillment somewhere ahead, you feel it pulsing now, in the simplest gestures of existence. The ordinary becomes miraculous, a glance, a sound, a breath. The miracle was never absent, it was only hidden beneath the fog of thought. This is the essence of awakening, to see again, but this time with the eyes of the soul. When perception is reborn, you no longer live in the mind, you live through consciousness itself. You perceive directly, without distortion, without defense. Life ceases to be a problem to solve and becomes a mystery to experience. You are not a separate observer anymore, you are part of the dance, both witness and movement. And as this reborn perception deepens, compassion naturally arises. You see that others are not enemies or strangers, they are expressions of the same consciousness wearing different faces. Their pain is not foreign to you, it is your own in another form. Judgment melts into understanding. Resistance turns into empathy. You no longer need to fix the world, you simply meet it with awareness, and awareness itself becomes the healing. In the rebirth of perception, you return to innocence. Not ignorance, but the purity of direct seeing. The eyes of the self look upon the world without pretense, without control, without fear. What you once sought through effort and striving reveals itself to have always been here, hidden behind the veil of the false mind. When perception is reborn, reality itself changes, not because the world shifts, but because you finally see it as it truly is, whole, interconnected, and infinitely alive. And in that seeing, you remember who you have always been, the witness behind all appearances, the stillness within all movement, the eternal awareness that no illusion can touch. That is the true rebirth, not of body or identity, but of vision, the awakening of eyes that no longer look through separation, but through the light of the self. The awakening of the real mind is not the acquisition of more thoughts, it is the transcendence of them. It is not an improvement of the intellect, but its surrender to something greater. The false mind believes that understanding can be achieved through analysis, through reasoning, through the accumulation of knowledge. But the real mind awakens when knowledge collapses into knowing, when thought bows before awareness. For most of life, the false mind runs the show. It builds a fortress of ideas around your identity, who you are, what is possible, what is safe. It lives in comparison, fear, and control. It tries to solve life as if life were a puzzle. It divides everything into opposites, right and wrong, success and failure, self and other, and then spends its existence trying to navigate between them. But the more it analyzes, the further it drifts from truth. Because truth is not a concept, it is an experience. It cannot be contained by words, only realized in silence. When the real mind begins to awaken, the chatter of the false one starts to lose its authority. You begin to notice the voice that constantly comments, worries, and plans. For the first time, you observe it rather than obey it. This is the first glimpse of freedom, the moment you recognize that you are not the voice in your head, but the awareness listening to it. The false mind hates this discovery, for its power depends on your identification with it. It will fight back with fear, with doubt, with distraction. But once you've seen the illusion, it can never fully deceive you again. The awakening of the real mind often begins through suffering. When all your strategies fail, when every belief collapses, when the intellect reaches the edge of its control, a deeper intelligence emerges, an intelligence that does not think but knows. It knows because it is aligned with the flow of life itself. It does not struggle to understand, it simply perceives. Jung called this the voice of the self, the organizing center of consciousness that transcends the ego's narrow lens. The real mind does not reject thought, it uses it wisely, as a servant rather than a master. It can think when needed, but it also knows how to be still. It sees thought as a tool of expression, not a measure of truth. In this awakened state, you can move through the world with clarity rather than confusion, because your perception arises from presence, not projection. Decisions become intuitive, spontaneous, and deeply aligned. You no longer calculate your path, you feel it. The false mind operates in time, the real mind lives in eternity. The false mind is obsessed with past and future, trapped in loops of regret and anticipation. The real mind resides in the timeless now, the only place where life truly happens. In that now, all tension dissolves. You see that nothing needs to be forced, because everything is unfolding in divine rhythm. The awakening of the real mind is not an escape from reality, it is an intimate union with it. When this awakening deepens, even your relationship to thought changes. You no longer fear your thoughts, nor do you worship them. You watch them rise and fall like waves on the surface of the ocean, knowing that you are the ocean itself. Awareness becomes your new identity, vast, still, and untouched by the turbulence above. The mind remains, but it becomes transparent, a clear channel for truth instead of a wall that hides it. This awakened intelligence expresses itself through insight, creativity, and love. It sees connection where the false mind saw separation. It acts not from reaction but from understanding. It no longer seeks validation because it recognizes itself in all things. The boundaries between thinker and thought, seer and seen, begin to blur. The mind becomes luminous, a mirror reflecting reality as it is, uncolored by fear or desire. And yet, this awakening is not a final state, it is a continuous unfolding. Each moment invites you to return to awareness, to choose truth over illusion. The real mind is always here, beneath the noise, waiting for your attention. It cannot be found through effort, because effort belongs to the false mind. It can only be remembered, like the sun revealed when clouds drift away. When the real mind awakens, life ceases to be a problem to solve and becomes a mystery to live. Every experience, joy or sorrow, success or failure, becomes an expression of the same consciousness learning to know itself. The separation between you and the world dissolves. You realize that awareness is not in you, you are an awareness. And in that realization, thought finally bows to silence. The endless striving, analyzing, defending, all falls away. What remains is presence, pure, alert, and infinite. This is not the end of thought, but the beginning of true intelligence, the intelligence of the self, where mind and spirit are one. The real mind is not something you awaken to, it is what awakens through you. It is the light behind the eyes, the stillness behind the storm, the eternal witness that has been waiting all along for you to remember it. The false mind can only pretend to live. The true mind breathes eternity. Choose the one that does not fear silence, and you will finally meet yourself.